So welcome everybody. I am Kathy Greenler Sexton. I am the CEO of Subscription Insider, and today is one of the many programs that we offer to help you running and operating subscription businesses. Today, I have Scott Adams, who is the co-founder and CEO of Fraud Deflect, and we're going to be talking about chargebacks, fraud, and false declines, how to protect subscription revenue in 2025.
So today, guys, we're going to talk about chargebacks, fraud, and false declines. Um, there's but just first, get to know me a little bit if you've not met me. I speak quite a bit at different shows, kind of getting back into that scene now that we have Fraud Deflect. But I've been doing fraud risk payments since like around 2000, 1999, 2000, somewhere in there. So tons of experience in the space. Started out, and most of my career, I was a merchant. I was at Riot Games. I helped Epic Games quite a bit. Uh, a whole lot of different experiences there. And my first company actually was an internet marketing company where we sold um, digital goods. And so back then, most of the tools didn't even exist, and we had to build them. We had to come up with ways to fight fraud. And I think today's environment makes that pretty interesting between VAMP and the other programs that are changing. Additionally, kind of on the personal side, also been doing jiu-jitsu since 2010. So I know how to fight real people and the virtual ones out there. Um, Married, got 3 kids, a couple of dogs. All of us are gamers as well, and we all do jiu-jitsu. So let's move on then. So really what we're talking about today is Mastercard, Amex, and Visa. I think the longest part of this discussion will be the Visa VAMP stuff. So let's start at Mastercard. So Mastercard's got a few things coming. So one, they're changing the rules around how we do authorizations. So it used to be that authorizations were just an authorization. You didn't have to tell them anything about it. It was just basically the dollar amount. And it could be a lower dollar amount, could be higher. Didn't matter really until you captured. But now, back in June, they made it so that you need to send a reason for that authorization. So, is it pre-auth or is it a final auth? And then additionally, with that, they've added fines, basically. So, if you don't send that reason for the authorization, then they added fees. So that's one thing they're doing. And then additionally, and I think this one kind of plays more into more things we're talking about today, is Mastercard's first party trust program. So it's very similar to compelling evidence 3 with Visa, but a little stricter. They require a few more data elements. But I think that this is maybe one of the most exciting things that the industry's been doing. It feels to me like what they're trying to do is shift things forward, like closer to the transaction, and to make things more automated. If you think about it, it's so difficult to put together all the paperwork, gather all the data, and do all these kind of things to do a representment after a chargeback's already happened. Plus, as hopefully you guys know, most of you I'm sure do, if you get a chargeback, it counts, right? It counts against you in your chargeback rates. But if you catch it before that, it doesn't. So that's always been kind of unfair. You go through all this work to represent, you win every representment. You would think they wouldn't count that, but it still does count in your chargeback rates. Your processor looks at those things. And, but if you use first party trust with MasterCard or Visa's C3, and that prevents it, it is not counting your chargeback rates. So, the more we can do before that chargeback actually hits the acquirer, the better. To just go over that a little bit more though. So MasterCard's first party trust, it's mostly targeted at what, we've really always called friendly fraud. I think a lot of people are also now trying to call it first party misuse, which is awesome, right? This is something we really should be preventing if we have the data to do it before it becomes a chargeback. Now, what you have to do though is you've got to send data. So, and this can be done actually through the 3DS rails during the transaction, or it can be done later. So like, as the chargeback process starts to get going, when if the consumer calls the issuer, and they say, hey, I didn't do this. What is this transaction? It must be fraud. As you guys probably know, right? It used to be that was a chargeback. We had no recourse really. Then came along the alert programs. Those allowed you to stop it, but you had to do a refund. So kind of a catch-22. It's like you don't want the chargeback, but you want to keep your money as a merchant. And so then these programs came out. And so if you have good data, and this is what I'm finding is the key to these programs, like, the slide says device and location data, that's huge. IP address is on here, but you probably know the IP address is not a great thing because it changes, right? It changes, in the States, some people it can change daily, others it can change monthly, others it might be, 6 months or when your power goes out. I know that's how it is at my house. But devices don't change near as much if you use a really good device service. You also need to have purchase history, and if it's a shippable product, delivery confirmations. If you pass all this data up, then the nice thing is that Mastercard will just step in programmatically and say there's no chargeback here. As long as the data points match previous transactions that were not charged back for fraud. So that tends to be the catch because it has to be after the 120 days of the chargeback cycle. And that's where I find
Scott, Flavio has a question about first-party data and digital goods.
Yeah. So both of card brands have made it so that for digital goods, you don't need the delivery confirmations. And also, since we're talking to subscription merchants here, one of the things that I remember calling out in the early days of these programs, or wait a minute, if it's digital and it's a subscription, how's data going to match, right? Because it's a merchant initiated transaction after the first transaction. And so that's kind of maybe a big tip to add here if you're trying to use these programs. You are allowed, and it's completely legitimate. It's actually called out in the documentation that you can put that device or that IP in the recurring transaction data. So, the initial transaction, you capture it. Then in the recurring and the merchant initiated transactions, you can put the device and or the IP address that you captured during the initial transaction. So that kind of fixes what seemed to be kind of a glaring error as they launched these programs. And it works great. Just the hard part is you have to do it. You have to remember to do it. You have to have it either in your data stored that way, or you have to make sure that it's injected in during the API calls with Mastercard and Visa on these. I also see another comment here. So do you think Mastercard is going to launch a new program following Visa's VAMP? So I was just at an event last week talking to Mastercard about this, and they're saying they're going to make changes. They're not saying that it's possibly going to follow VAMP. So I don't really know. My opinion is that they'll probably be in the middle. Just from the past, from looking at Mastercard versus Visa over the years, most of the time, Mastercard waits, right? They kind of wait. Let's see what's going to happen. Let's see how the program works at Visa. And then like a year later, they'll do something. Sometimes it's pretty much the same. First party trust is very, very similar to CE3, but it's not exactly the same. And I think Mastercard has probably seen with how confusing VAMP has been. And so, maybe they won't go down that road exactly. But flip side, I think that, and we're going to talk about this more later. That's the third segment of this webinar is about VAMP. But it's really the whole idea that what the card brands really want to remind us that we are responsible for fraud as merchants. Now they're doing their part, we need to do our part. And a lot of the tools we've been using, they're great tools, and if you use them in the, for the reason they wanted to create these programs, awesome. But some merchants aren't, right? Some kind of hide a problem instead of fixing in their business model, they use alerts. So I think there's both of these things are good products. They're good tools to use, but we also need to look at pre-auth fraud too. So we'll talk about that more, but I think that's kind of where all this is coming from. So Mastercard, I don't think they're going to do a program like VAMP, but I think we'll do something with a similar goal, just to protect the ecosystem as a whole. So, really all these things with Mastercard, what are the impacts, especially on recurring merchants? I think one of the problems, like friendly fraud and also with these new auth issues with subscriptions, it's tough, right? Because most of the time you're selling something, you're selling the subscription, and maybe it's a low cost trial. Maybe even if it's a full cost trial, but it's month to month, you don't make a lot of money on that first transaction, right? That's how I grew my first business that I ran for like 10 years. It was, I don't think I made money till my second or third rebill. And so when we are exposed, have issues with friendly fraud, chargebacks, it causes problems. Um, I think, as I was saying, kind of around first party trust, but also with any of these other types, the things that Mastercard's doing, it comes down to data, right? That's how anti-fraud works. If you don't have good data, it's really, really, really hard to prevent fraud. And so you want to be thinking all the time and make sure, if any fraud people out there, if you own the product, the program at your business, most of the time, you can store more data than you could otherwise, right? As long as that data is only used for fraud. So you want to be careful, obviously, with PII, but you can hash that kind of data. There's all sorts of ways that you can use it. You just have to make sure it doesn't get in marketing hands. Uh, but it's so important to have good data. I see merchants all the time trying not to store data. Like their IT team, their security team says, no, you can't store anything unless you've got a really great explanation. Fraud's a good explanation. Fraud's a good reason to do it, but you got to protect it. So there's kind of a balancing act there. Additionally, I think with these changes at Mastercard, not as much first party trust, but with authorizations, there's more fees, right? So this is going to can start costing more and more money if you're not compliant. But it's really not that hard to get compliant. It's probably a little bit of coding changes. Check with your gateway, check with your PSPs to see how that works for you, but make the change. Otherwise, it's costing you more and more money over time. And, first party trust, I really think that and C3 are kind of the future and where things are going to go over time is the better data you have and then passing it up in real time as the transaction's happening. It's huge. So, so just really make sure you're capturing all that data, store the metadata, store anything that makes sense, and think about, what story you're trying to tell with your data. What stories do you need to be able to tell? All right, so timelines. So we've already got, June 17th has passed. Actually, all these have passed. So you were supposed to have been started doing the authorization classifications back in June. Probably might want to check your statements if you weren't, because you might have more fees. Looks like those started on July 1st. And then on the 25th of June, they officially launched first party trust, although that's been kind of more in beta for quite a while now. So look into that if you're not using it. And if you need help, you can talk to us at Fraud Deflect. So I guess any other questions before we move on from Mastercard? It's always the hard part about webinars. I can't see your faces. And
I know. I think we're good.
all right, awesome. Then we'll keep moving. So Amex. Interestingly, Amex is not one you talk about a lot because, a lot of merchants take it, but they don't get a too high a percentage. And so we don't tend to focus on it too much, but they have made some pretty big key changes lately. So I think this is a really big one with CID, right? So it's always so easy to forget. It's not a 3-digit code here, it's 4 digits. It's on the front of your Amex card. So it used to be that, and think about this, remember that Amex they have, in most cases, they own the full loop. So they're both issuer in many, many cases, and they're the acquirer. And so in this case, if the CID does not match, it used to be that it was still a problem where the merchant had to deal with it. But yet that doesn't make a lot of sense because Amex has control of this. So they've made that change. Now, if the CID does not match and they approve the transaction, the liability shifts to them. So this is something to look in your data and see, because this actually went into effect quite a while ago. But honestly, I wasn't really aware of it until we were researching for this. So I think that could be pretty interesting. I'm just definitely going to check our clients' data where we have it. And then in April, they expanded their fraud full recourse program. So this basically kind of it changes how the chargebacks are handled and what kind of triggers are there for inclusion. So, with the CID mismatch, just to be super clear, we're not liable as merchants if the CID does not match that for a chargeback. So, pretty big deal, I think. This should make the checkout experience better. And, it really gives us more leeway, right? You may decide you want to accept that transaction. Like a lot of times I tell merchants to look at those codes, but run the numbers. In your data, how often if the CID does not match, does that turn into fraud for you? Now, a lot of merchants, it does. And so, I generally say don't accept it. But now that we have a liability shift, that could be something to think about. And then, like the tip says, right there, or the details here, say that's something you could actually do. That might improve your authorization rates. It might improve your bottom line. Now, as far as the full recourse program, I think the big thing here is that now it's kind of funny, it's 0.9% being the threshold. So, that was the old percentages we worried about with Visa. And so now Amex has one. And if you're over that rate, or if you're over $25,000, then that could put you into a program with Amex. So it's something we need to be looking for and watch out for. But also, think about it. How much transaction volume do you get from Amex? Right? It really depends on what type of business you are. And remember, most consumers, they have an Amex, they have other cards. So you have to weigh the risk here. I mean, we definitely watch that in our statistics here. Right. And so, if you think about with these two changes, right, maybe you should accept more transactions that do not have a match. But you also need to look really closely on the fraud, right? So if your chargeback rate's over 0.9% with Amex, it's now going to pose more of a challenge for us. So we need to keep close match on that, or close watch on that. And then as far as monitoring, we want to monitor our fraud performance. So you stay under the thresholds, and then look at other indicators, right? You could be things like safe key, which is really 3D secure. Now in the States, and I saw the list earlier, I didn't see a lot of people outside of the United States, but if you're outside of the States, this is pretty standard for you. In the USA, not near as much. We don't like to change, and we like to have control, and we'd like to check our process to be really easy. And so, I don't know if SafeKey would work here very well, but it might, right? I have seen it happen on travel. When I book travel with my Amex card, it'll pop up sometimes. And I think it's up to the merchant, but I'm not sure how good that is for a lot of subscription merchants. And remember, SafeKey doesn't work on subscription, only that first transaction. And I just go back to, again, look at your data, right? What's your chargeback rate been on Amex? If it's normally below 0.9, nothing to worry about. If it's over a lot, you probably do need to be looking at it. All right. So any other questions here? Let's see.
There was one, just a comment from Joel. Hypothetically, it would not be optimal to not even ask for a CID for Amex then?
That's something that I would test. So I never recommend not doing CID, but in this case, I suspect that you would get a much lower authorization rate, right? Generally, when the card brands have these kind of rules and things shift to the issuer, like if it was the normal four-party system with Visa and Mastercard, the issuer generally tightens controls. And so I would suspect we'll see the same thing with Amex. But it's definitely something to look at. Like I'm a huge proponent of testing, right? I can tell you what I think and what I've seen from the past, but I don't know. So I would test it. But I would bet though that you'll have lower authorization rates. All right. I don't see any more questions here. So let's move on to what I think is going to be the hotter topic. I know every event I've been to in the last few months, this has been all anyone wanted to talk about. So VAMP, This one's been interesting, to say the least, right? We've known about this for about a year. And just like every other regulation that you know about it ahead of time, most people ignored it until it was almost upon them. But it's almost like Visa knew that would happen. So they decided to wait till about, you know, March, April, May to all of a sudden make changes to it. They also made a change as early as January. But now I think we're going to hold steady. So I was just at an event last week and was talking to the head of, I'm not sure if she's the head of the program, but she had a lot to do with and knows the regulations around VAMP from Visa Risk. And I asked her that point blank because merchants keep asking me, okay, they changed it 3 times. Are they going to change it again? And the merchants are all saying, oh, they think it will. But I think it's wishful thinking. Say I did talk to Visa about it. They said they're not changing it again. So we'll see what happens. You never know. Merchants are still pushing back just because it is still a pretty big change. So to go over that. So this is what you're seeing on my screen now. These are the old rules, right? So forever, chargeback counts have just been chargebacks, right? We didn't worry so much about the fraud flag transactions. You had to say under 0.9, or, for a long time it was 1%. Then it went to 0.9%. People panicked over that, but it didn't turn out to be that big of a change. And also, one of the most annoying things about the old program was that you had to get out. When you got out, though, you had to stay out for 3 months. You had to keep your transactions, your chargeback rate below the threshold for 3 straight months. Otherwise, you went right back in and things reset. You never actually left, in fact. And also, merchants were monitored by the mid, or you could roll things up, kind of like the dynamic descriptor. Things would roll up to the whatever's before the star. Now, this is the old program. So the new program is definitely more complicated. It's definitely harder to track. And a lot of merchants, I don't even know if they're about to track it. Like I've looked at, your bigger merchants, you guys have access to this data easier than the smaller guys, right? It really depends on their ISOs or PSPs. If you're a bigger merchant, you're direct with a top acquirer, you can most of the time get the data. So here's kind of how it's going to work now. So per regulations, what's published in the Visa documentation is that the merchant threshold is 2.2% starting in April, which just passed. And then, but it's kind of on call it a trial period. So we can all figure this out. And so there's no enforcement yet. Now that enforcement is going to start in October this year. So, we're in early August now. So we basically have 2 months, almost exactly when the subscription show is on October, actually, is when it launches. Now, also the acquirers, they have their own threshold. So acquirers have 3 levels. They have early warning, they have above standard, they have excessive. Now, early warning, there's no fines. Above standard and excessive, there is. So those percentages are 0.4 to 0.5. Then Visa will warn the acquirer, say, hey, your portfolio was over threshold. Then there's above standard, which starts at 0.5. And then excessive is a 0.7. So, but remember, this is supposed to be for their whole portfolio. But what I got to tell you, I think every week for the last month, I've heard from merchants telling me that their PSPs or their acquirers are actually alerting them and telling them that they have to get their rates lower if they're over the acquirer thresholds. Yeah, that's going to be interesting. If you don't know, like if you take nothing from this webinar but one thing, know your VAMP rate. You've got to figure that out. We'll talk about how you can do that and how you calculate in a second. But it's so important because this is not going away. I really don't think this is going to change before October, and we're only 2 months out. So, and then the other thing to note here, at least on this slide, is in April, the merchant threshold goes down to 1.5%. So starting at 2.2, then they're still, they've given us kind of 6 months, April to October, to figure it out, to start getting our rates down. They're going to start fining acquirers and merchants if they're over the appropriate thresholds in April. in October, but then in April, they're going to lower those again. So here's how VAMP is going to work. And this is what's kind of concerning to me, at least, is that chargebacks, your TC15, you're used to this, right? Every single merchant, I hope, out there knows you got to keep those chargebacks down. Now, the other side of it, though, is what I've always called fraud flag transactions. Like, I don't like to call them disputes because we pretty much interchangeably use dispute and chargeback as the same thing, and they're not. So fraud flag transaction is your TC40 report. Like, if you've ever worked with me in the past or just talked to me at a conference, that's something I always encourage merchants to do, is get their TC40 data. What this is, if you don't know, is that it's another way for the issuer to report a suspicious transaction. But in this case, they might not turn it into a chargeback. So you might think, well, that makes no sense. You're kind of right, but remember, the issuer, it costs them money to do a chargeback. Not only do they have fees, but then they have people that they have to pay to work these things. And then us merchants, we do representments. When that data gets to the issuer, they have to process that. They have to figure out and rule on it, basically. Is this a chargeback or not? Is it valid or not? And so it's rumored that that costs anywhere from $50 to $100 per chargeback for the issuer. So what I've often seen by digging through the data is that if you're a lower ticket merchant, and this varies by issuer, you'll get a lot more TC40s than you will get chargebacks. And so, if you've not researched this, you really need to. If you're a lower ticket merchant, let's say $25 and under, you really have to look at it like, I hope you already have looked at it, because it's getting to be too late. You need to understand this stuff. Now, if you weren't familiar with TC40 before, just a little bit more information for you. So there's no way to represent or appeal these. Like, merchants have literally no recourse as far as fighting a fraud flag transaction, right? Once it's on the TC40, it will be on the TC40. You cannot remove it. But the nice thing, you don't lose money. So if they don't do a chargeback and only flag it for fraud, it flows through the system. The acquirer knows about it, but you may not, at least up until now. And there's no money coming out of your bank account. And so unless you're like a really low ticket with super high volume, you probably never heard of this or never worried about it. And that was fine. You didn't need to. I mean, it's good data, but it's not data that you had to have. But nowadays it is. You absolutely have to have it. So here's the math. And I've always joked about that when I speak. It's like, there's the Visa math and the Mastercard math, right? The Visa math has always been the number of chargebacks reported in whatever month you're trying to figure the rate, divided by settled transactions from that same month. So, this is August. It's the 6th of August. So in a couple more days, acquirers in the past would be notifying you, generally around the 10th, that your chargeback rate was too high, right? And so to do that math, you would look at all the chargebacks reported in July divided by the the settled transactions from July. And that's what we've done for years. But now we have VAMP. So VAMP adds some more complexity to this. It adds in all your TC40 transactions. So anything the issuer flagged for fraud, whether it became a chargeback or not, in that same month, divided by settled transactions. So one of the questions I always get here, and I'll just jump in and ask myself a question, is, but wouldn't this turn into duplicates? Like, can I remove duplicates from this? And the answer is yes, it can, and no, you can't. So if you think about it, right, I just said TC40s sometimes are chargebacks. So let's say you have a chargeback that's for fraud. It will almost for sure have a TC40 along with it, and that does count twice. So they're double dipping there. And when that change happened, that was something they changed back in March. That's why they upped the threshold to 2.2%, and then to 1.5 for 6 months from then. But it's going to be tough, right? You see all sorts of things in the TC40 reports, and many of you, if you don't know this rate, you're going to be shocked, because people always say, "Oh, well, not a big deal, because my chargeback rate's 0.2%." and I use RDR. I see a question around that. I'll answer in a second. So I use RDR. I use ethical alerts. I use CDRN. So my chargeback rate's 0.2%. So 0.2%. I've seen a lot of merchants that have that situation, and they end up, when you calculate the VAMP rate, at well over threshold. So if you don't know, you got to figure that out. So somebody here asks, so does that include TC40s covered under RDR? So RDR does not and never will impact the TC40. So you still want to use RDR. RDR will remove it from the chargeback side of this slide. It will not remove it from the TC40. Now, compelling evidence 3 prevents things from going to the TC40. Order insight could prevent things from going to the TC40, right? So if you win, then there's no chargeback. There's no dispute. You don't end up on the TC40 or having a chargeback. So someone else here asked me, so let's define RDR. So RDR is Visa's rapid dispute resolution. And so this is a product, like, think about alerts. And if you know what alerts are, so we have CDRN, which is a verified product. Visa owns that company. This is a product that it's pre-chargeback. So if you think about the flow of things, right? So the consumer calls the issuer. They say, I didn't do this. What is this? This is fraud. Then the issuer has a choice, right? If they wish, they just can hit chargeback. Now we have more tools. So we have Order Insight, and I'm focusing right now on Visa since we're talking about VAMP, but Mastercard has a similar product. So if you have Order Insight, we can pass more data up to the issuer. It'll show up during the phone call on their screen. And in that case, what happens is that ideally the issuer will basically convince the consumer. Say, hey, consumer, look, here's what you bought. Here's where you bought it. Here's all your order details. Here's your purchase history with this merchant. Literally, they can tell all sorts of things. And ideally, what happens is they're basically an extension of your customer service. So in that case, if the consumer or the issuer decides, you know what, this shouldn't be a chargeback, it won't be a chargeback. And most likely, the issuer will not report it as fraud either. So Order Insight in that case will remove stuff from the chargeback side and the TC40 side of this equation. Now, but I want to be careful. I'm saying remove. It doesn't really remove anything. It prevents it from getting there in the first place. If something gets to the acquirer as a TC40, it's there. So somebody asks, so RDR will not factor into the VAMP ratio calculation. So it does, but it does not. So it does not take anything off the TC40. If you get a TC40, you got it. It's counting. It does prevent chargebacks. Or if you guys know the details of RDR, RDR looks like the chargeback. If your if your processor is not reporting it right, it might show up as a chargeback. But Visa says it doesn't count. All right. So with Fraud Deflect, our portal shows you, here's your RDRs, and then you can get the ARNs and compare them to your chargebacks. If your acquirer is telling you have chargebacks, if you have an RDR with the same ARN, that's not a chargeback. Right. So in this case, RDR removes it from the chargeback side, prevents it from showing up there, but it does not take it off the TC40. So reading another question here. So for this to take effect on a merchant between Visa and the merchant, there's a minimum number of 1,500 of those transactions on a merchant account, correct? I know that the processing banks still assume liability for the high TC40, so merchants is still accountable to the processor, but not to Visa. Is that correct? So yeah, so what I've been telling merchants, like, I've pretty much been ignoring the 1,500, but that is correct. The Visa will not call out the merchant to the acquirer if they don't have at least 1,500. They define it, I believe, as disputes, but basically that's chargebacks plus TC40. But I can tell you, every single merchant that I've talked to, every acquirer I've talked to, they're pretty much ignoring this, right? They have to keep their portfolio under those limits we talked about earlier. So they can do that however they want. And as this person also says, they have liability. So, and that's something that I think is really important to understand if you didn't understand that. If you go out of business, the acquirer or a sponsored bank or somebody on the other side is going to have to pay. The consumer will get their money back. So because of that, we've got to remember that, yeah, we have these rates that Visa says they're monitoring, but the acquirer can have totally different ones. In most cases, so far, what I'm seeing, they're using the acquirer thresholds. So you have to be really careful of that. And I would not say, hey, you know what, guess what? I'm safe. I'm under 1500. Probably not going to work. Let's see. So somebody says, it's an interesting question. So Joel here says, so again, hypothetically, just hypothetically, of course, if I run tons of transaction or fraud transactions, I can get a processor blacklisted. I guess so, hypothetically. I wouldn't do it, but I would assume they would catch you way before it became a problem for them. They monitor things pretty closely. So that's an interesting question, though. But yeah, really, guys, like RDR and VAMP, that's been the confusing part, is that merchants keep thinking, well, wait, what about RDR? What about alerts? So RDR, again, it does impact VAMP, but just the chargeback side. And then, there's other tools we can use. So speaking of those tools, so, we talked about earlier, what I think, and this is absolutely not anyone else's opinion, it's mine, is that the card brands are trying to get us merchants to refocus, right? Think about how things were in the past. I said I started out 20 something years ago. We didn't have alerts. We didn't really even have anti-fraud tools. We had to figure this stuff out. And so back then we were stopping the fraud very well. Now it costs us more because we had more false positives, but then, we got more tools and things evolved. So I think what we have to do is kind of combine the old and the new. So, we've talked about this a little bit already, but here's it on your screen. So I don't know, Kathy or somebody, can you see my mouse on this?
I can.
Okay, awesome. So most of the time as fraud professionals, we start right here, right? We generally start at order placed and then go through here. We ignore this part. So I think one of the best presentations I ever did in, live and they got really good reviews and a lot of comments and questions was when I talked about this. So what I think you should do is look across your whole customer journey, right? If marketing says one thing, your order sales page say something else, one, you'll probably get bad conversion, right? But two, if the consumer remembers this, buys the product, comes down here, doesn't get the product they thought they were going to get, you're going to get chargebacks. So look at your marketing, look at your sales and order pages. Think about that. So ignore marketing for a second. If the consumer goes to the sales page and they promise one thing on the sales page, then the order page is different or varies a bit. Not good. Also, could get chargebacks. And then think about your order page. And this, so we generally start around here, but still, I've met a lot of merchants that don't think about this. If for your order page, is it clear? I think the Federal Trade Commission actually says it has to be clear and conspicuous that it's a subscription. So think about that. Is this clear? Do the people know what they're buying? And when they hit that order button, that pay button, nowadays we get a text message. Like my card, send me a text or send me a push notification. That number better match what it looks like on the order page. I see a lot of subscription merchants try to hide or make it not so clear what that subscription price will be. So hopefully none of you guys, but if you're doing that, it's not going to fly anymore. It's going to get harder and harder to do those kind of things. Now, for quite a while, I've been saying that pre-auth isn't near as important because of things like RDR and ethical alerts and CDRN and order insight, et cetera. But VAMP, I think, is pushing us back this direction. So now I'm saying, we need pre-auth. You need really good device fingerprinting. You need really good, maybe behavioral can play really heavily into this stuff. But what I wouldn't do is get too heavy-handed. So, we're always worried about false positives. So depending on where your chargeback and now your VAMP rate is, think about some pre-auth anti-fraud. But if there's much of a chance this is a good transaction, don't decline it, because then you can have our early post-auth things like, or deflection services like Order Insight, interception services. That's the alerts we were talking about. So I started to talk about this, but jumped ahead. So going back with it, with this process, right? So deflection, this is Order Insight. This is consumer clarity. Then interception, that's the alerts we're all used to. So Ethica, CDRN, those two products technically sit outside of the rails, right? So the issuer might press chargeback, but their CRM, their system is coded so that it will say, hey, wait, this merchant is using verified CDRM or Ethica alerts. It then sends it to them instead of the card brands. So this way, you as a merchant, you have a chance to do a refund. As long as you do it quickly and data points match up, you'll never see the chargeback. And in that case, you also, most of the time, I'm seeing 60, 70% or so of the time, you will not get a TC40 either. But that's up to the issuing bank, how they coded it. And remember, they might not even know, right? They gave programmers instructions to create their CRM. Maybe they didn't tell them where to put this. So it's hard to say, it's hard to see, but if you can look at pretty much per bin, per issuer, how they handle it. And so, I think you have to combine all this stuff. To really do VAMP right, to improve your VAMP rates, I think you have to combine all of it. Look across the whole customer journey. So, we kind of went through these already, but, make sure everything's fully in alignment. So the message from marketing all the way through to delivery. If you're subscription, don't be afraid to communicate with your consumers. Continue to remind them, tell them what they're getting, tell them why it's so great. You don't have to give them an email that says, hey, you're going to be charged again. Do you want to cancel? But you should be giving them some information, making sure they understand that they are going to be building it. Just a little reminder, hey, I like this product. I don't want to cancel it. I don't want to charge it back, but I am going to be rebuilt. And that's okay. Anti-fraud, obviously, kind of the really old stuff, CVV, AVS, if you're a USA merchant, as simple as looking for duplicates. Does it make sense? That goes into velocity too. Does it make sense that a consumer bought something 3 times in an hour? Maybe for some of you. A lot of you, it doesn't make any sense at all. Machine learning, obviously, we've been using that a long time. I say we need it. Maybe not as harsh as it used to be, but we got to balance this. Depends on where your rates are. I think AI and there should be a slash here. AI and device fingerprinting, behavioral, all this plays in. Fraud Deflect, we use all this. We actually have a device fingerprinting solution now that we own, we built. It's really cool if you haven't seen it yet, but it plays into all this. And this kind of the old ways, that's what we say. The new ways, so I put business rules velocities here in the new way too, because I think we need to think about it differently. Just think really hard about what makes sense for your business. But you can also get pretty complex here. Look at, at the issuer level. How do issuers treat VAMP? How do they treat low ticket, high ticket, et cetera? So you could even have rules around that. AI machine learning may pull that stuff out, but it might not. If you need to move fast, you might need rules because AI and machine learning take time. And then, Order Insight, we've talked about this already today. I think Order Insight's where things are going and consumer clarity. Like we actually started Fraud Deflect because we wanted to promote these products. Really just Order Insight and clarity and CE3 and first party trust, because that solves the problem. It doesn't hide it, right? We're giving more information to make sure that the consumer knows what they bought, because there's so many reasons, right? The scriptures can be bad. It can be, maybe some confusion from the sales process, whatever it might be. So the more information we provide to the consumer and to the issuer, the better off we are. And we're, at least with our implementation of it, we're seeing really good success of preventing TC40s and preventing chargebacks. And the beauty of it is there's no refund. It's not like an alert where you have to refund it. You keep your money. And again, we're talking to subscription merchants today mostly. You keep your subscription. So you might get many more rebills out of this, thus raising your lifetime value. And like I said, that was my past. That's what I did the first 10 years of my career was subscription billing. Um, then we talked about, again, CDR and ethical alerts. So these sit outside of the rails. So that means if you prevent it with one of those products, it should not show up in the TC40 in most cases because it's not part of that process. You've taken it out of those rails. Now, RDR is more confusing. And again, it only protects you from a chargeback. It does not protect you from TC40. So you need it probably, but be careful. Don't assume it'll solve things. The same way, compelling evidence 3, the reason I put 2 stars there, I'm hearing over and over, and it's driving me nuts, that a lot of our competitors are saying, hey, we have a solution to VAMP. It's CE3. But I could probably ask the audience, and I would if I could see your faces and point at one of you. But how many, if you're a subscription merchant, which probably all of you are today, how many times do you get a charge back on the 5th transaction? So I'm waiting for answers. No one's answering. So all they're out there, you don't, right? You get it on the 1st, not either the 1st or you get it on the 1st rebill. So because of that, CE3 will not work. You have to get 120 days, basically +1. So if a transaction is billed today, they're going to go back and are there 2 transactions that were not charged back for fraud? More than 120 days old. So think about your numbers. Now, some of you guys, hopefully a lot of you, it'll work great. But I don't think it will. I think it's a great product and it's going to be evolving over time, but it's not going to solve your problem. All right, let's see. So question.
We have some peanut gallery going back and forth. Just trying to ask anybody if they have any other questions here.
Yeah, I'm not going to read through all this because it'd take me too long and I'll be too quiet on this webinar. So you have any questions about Kathy?
Right now we don't have, because we've been doing a very, very good job of asking questions as we've gone along. There's really good, smart questions from everybody. So cheers to all of you for doing that. So what are some of the biggest mistakes that you're seeing from merchants as they start going down this new VAMP path? That's a question I have. And another question is, let's say, I mean, we've all experienced this. Somebody's pressure testing credit cards, and even though we have all the fraud stuff, we get a few that come through. How's that going to impact us as we go through? So there's a couple questions, and I'm beginning to see a few more come in.
All right. Well, so I'll kind of talk to that one. So that's, although we're talking about VAMP in these latest slides, I purposely didn't talk about a few of the components. One was the 1500, which somebody mentioned, because again, I think as a merchant, you should ignore that. Your processors are not going to only, ping you and complain to you that you're too high if you're over that limit. So I would ignore that one. Now the other component I didn't talk about, in part because this is kind of hard to manage, and I haven't seen any processors saying anything about it, but I think they will in the future, is enumeration. So VAMP does have a part in the regulation that says if your enumeration rate, I believe if it's over 20%, or if you're over 20%, then you can get in the program for that as well. And so to define that, enumeration, apparently it's not super cut and dry, but what I'm telling merchants to do is it's pretty much card testing. It's what Kathy just mentioned. Especially if you're a lower ticket merchant, people probably test your system all the time. If they haven't yet, they will, right? Because it's a easy barrier to entry, right? So all they're trying to do is see if the credit card works. Once it works, they move on to the merchant with a higher ticket. Then they go sell that card for lots of money. So, what I think Visa's trying to do, and again, in my opinion, is again trying to get us to remember that we could stop that up front. And I was even talking to a PSP, I think it's 2 or 3 weeks ago, and they said they lost millions to these guys, to people card testing, because remember, every authorization costs money.
Yep.
I don't know about your contract with your PSPs, but for the most part, you have a clause in there. It's probably on your term sheet that has, you might pay a nickel, a penny, a dime per authorization. So And that's where it seems like a lot of merchants are relying on their gateway or their PSP to stop these kind of problems. You can do that, I guess, but it's going to cost you money. And now VAMP's saying, hey, wait, you maybe should try to catch it before the off. And that's where, like I said, so we just launched the new product that's not even really even on our website yet, that is behavioral device fingerprinting. And with that, we can catch high velocity attacks of any kind, basically, before you send it to authorization. So you don't have to use ours. There's a lot of products out there. Pretty much any of the anti-fraud suites can stop this stuff. You just have to make sure you have a velocity rule in there that says deny if there's more than X per minute or X per 10 minutes or day. Again, whatever makes sense for your business. Does that answer your question, Kathy?
Yeah, it does. We're going to take one more question, but before we do that, if anybody wants Scott to send a copy of this, put your email here or your name or whatever. We'll connect that. We will be putting this up for on-demand playback for everybody, so you can watch it again with your team. And then finally, for those who are Subscription Insider members, we'll be putting this up in the membership portal for you for unlimited access. So we've got you covered many, many different ways. This is a dense presentation with lots and lots of info, and I am sure lots of questions for you, Scott. So thank you very, very much. And we've got some people really wanting that, which is great. So before we run out of time, I think way up there was a question here from Bamidel, which is can you walk us through, I guess this is a starting practical process of managing but not breaching VAMP ratios if one suspects to have a high number of high-risk merchants?
So, the first thing I think you need to get to the TC40 data. So I don't know what your situation is, but if you're connected to a big enough, based on the wording, I'm guessing that you're a processor or ISO, PSP, something like that. So talk to your acquirers. They should have the ability to get you that data. Now, I have heard from some processors that can't easily do it because they have, if you're like an ISO, the acquirer has to have the code, the situation to break those reports down and give you just your TC40. If you don't have that, so you can verify. There's ways to get it from Verify through one of their products. That's one of the things Fraud Deflect can do for you too, is we can provide a real-time feed of the TC40 data. But first, that's step one. Get your TC40 data. And then figure out that VAMP rate, right? Once you know your VAMP rate, that's a start. That'll tell you where you are. And then break it down. So what I always encourage, and what our UI does, is it shows you not only your VAMP rate, but it shows you your TC15 that count against spam. So everything but RDRs for chargebacks. And it takes your TC40 data and shows you that. So that number, see where your problem is, right? Is it mostly chargebacks or is it mostly TC40? And then if it's mostly TC40, which for most of you, it probably will be. If you watch, Kathy's other webinars, I'm sure you've learned enough to get your chargebacks down, but now you got to get the TC40s down. And that's where it gets a little more old school. So if you're not using alerts, you should be using those. They can help that. If that's not enough, and if your VAMP rate is high, it won't be quite enough. I highly encourage using Order Insight and Consumer Clarity, First Party Trust, and Compelling Evidence 3. Those are really meant to tackle this problem, to tackle friendly fraud. But be aware, it takes a lot of work. You need a lot of data, and you need to manage and prepare that data correctly. And then handling the APIs, et cetera. And that's something that Fraud Deflect can do. But you can also do it through someone else or directly through Verify and or Ethica. And then look beyond that, right? Stop enumeration. Stop anything that you know is fraud. Pre-auth. Save yourself on authorizations. Keep your mid healthy from that perspective. But so you really just got to take it step by step. Look at each component, and then do what I said earlier, right? Look at the whole customer journey. It's kind of shocking. If you look here. What I don't mention here, customer support. Make sure
Yep.
CS knows what to say. I can tell you so many times we've done reviews for clients and the fraud team. So are you guys on this call? You say, oh no, my support team's awesome. They even in my chats, the bots that tell you, how to get a refund are perfect. Go do it. Place an order, do a refund. Place an order, call to get a refund. Place an order, use your chat bot. I've had some of I can tell you one, I can't tell you the brand, but one of the biggest brands in the world. They told me, assured me everything was perfect. Their chat bot was saying, if you want a refund, call your bank. Yeah,
Yep.
we all know what
Yep.
that means. That's a
Hmm.
chargeback and a TC40, most likely.
Oh,
So,
I've seen that before. Ages ago, I was part of a team. We acquired this company, and we're in the company we acquired was in the chargeback program. So we're trying to figure this out, and customer service was telling people to call their bank and their cards. So we stopped that, and miraculously the chargeback rate lowered. So you need to look
don't,
holistically
don't
at
assume.
it.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
don't assume.
More
Always test.
stories.
Yep.
Well, Scott, thank you so, so much. I want to thank everybody for participating today. Lots of great questions, lots of great info, and I'm really looking forward to seeing everybody and you and the team at Subscription Show in October. So thank you very, very much.